In the quiet of her cottage, Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed sleuth, records a chilling secret from her youth, a 1923 manor murder hidden by lies and a stolen sapphire. With clues like a glove and a poisoned sprig, she unravels greed and betrayal, choosing silence to protect her family while ensuring justice whispers through time.
Chapter 1. Whispers from the Attic. The rain tapped softly on the windows of Miss Jane Marple's little cottage in St. Mary Mead. It was a gray, chilly evening, the kind that made you want to curl up with a warm blanket and a cup of tea. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a cozy glow across the room. Miss Marple, now old and frail, her hair white as snow, sat in her favorite armchair. Her knitting needles clicked gently, but her mind was far away, tangled in memories she hadn't touched in years. On the table beside her sat an old gramophone, its brass horn dull with age. Next to it was a small stack of wax records, dusty and forgotten. She'd found the machine that morning, tucked away in the attic under a pile of old quilts. With it was a letter, yellowed and crinkled, sealed with her cousin Clara's familiar red wax. The sight of it had stirred something deep in Jane's heart, a secret she'd kept for decades, one she'd never spoken aloud. Tonight she felt the weight of it pressing on her. It was time to tell the story, if only to the quiet air of her cottage. She reached for the gramophone, her fingers trembling slightly. The machine whirred to life with a soft hum, and she leaned close to the horn. "This is Jane Marple," she said, her voice soft but clear, like a bell ringing through fog. "I'm an old woman now, and there's something I must confess. Not for the world to hear, perhaps, but for my own peace. It's about a summer long ago when I was young and the world seemed bright, until it wasn't." She paused, her eyes drifting to the rain-streaked window. Her mind slipped back to 1923, to a grand manor house in the countryside where the air smelled of roses and secrets. She was barely 20 then, shy but sharp, with a knack for noticing things others missed. The manor belonged to her uncle, Sir Henry Langley, a man with a loud laugh and a quick temper. That summer he'd invited the whole family, cousins, aunts, and distant relatives for a grand gathering. It was meant to be a celebration, but it turned into something else entirely. Jane closed her eyes, letting the memory unfold like a book. She could see the manor's tall stone walls covered in ivy and the wide lawn where children played. The house was alive with chatter and music, the clink of glasses and the rustle of silk dresses. But beneath it all, there was a hum of something darker, whispers of a missing necklace, an heirloom worth a fortune. It was a sapphire pendant passed down through the Langley family for generations. Sir Henry had bragged about it at dinner, holding it up to catch the candlelight. By morning, it was gone. Jane's voice grew quieter as she spoke into the gramophone. "I was young then, and I didn't know what to make of it, but I noticed things, little things. The way people looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, the way hands fidgeted or voices dropped when certain names were mentioned. I didn't know it then, but I was already knitting together the threads of a mystery." She remembered the first night of the gathering. The manor's great hall was bright with chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of lavender and cigar smoke. Jane, in her simple blue dress, felt out of place among the glittering guests. Her cousin Clara, bold and beautiful, was the center of attention, dancing with every young man who asked. Uncle Henry stood by the fireplace, his face red from wine, telling stories of his travels. Aunt Beatrice, his wife, sat quietly, her eyes darting to the doorway as if expecting someone who never came. Jane had stayed on the edges, watching. She saw the maid, Elsie, drop a tray of glasses when Uncle Henry raised his voice. She noticed Clara's quick glance at a tall stranger in a black suit, a man who introduced himself as Mr. Carver, a friend of the family. And she saw her uncle's valet, Thomas, slip out of the room with a nervous look, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Jane's voice crackled through the gramophone. "I kept that glove," she said. "It was my first clue, though I didn't know it then. I tucked it into my sewing box, thinking it might mean something later. I was right." The rain outside grew heavier, drumming on the cottage roof. Jane leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. The gramophone spun quietly, capturing her words. She remembered how the manor had felt alive with secrets, each one a thread she'd later learned to pull. But back then, she was just a girl, curious and quiet, with no idea how deep the mystery would go. "I didn't know it would lead to murder," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The necklace was the only beginning. She stopped the gramophone with a click, the needle lifting with a faint scratch. The room fell silent, save for the rain and the fire's soft puff. Jane stared at the machine, her heart heavy. She wasn't sure why she'd started this confession tonight, but the letter from Clara had stirred something she couldn't ignore. It was as if her cousin, long gone, was urging her to speak. Jane rose slowly, her joints stiff, and shuffled to the window. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet beyond the glass, its lights dim in the rain. She thought of the manor, of that summer, of the people who'd filled it with laughter and lies. She was so young, so eager to understand the world. And she had. Too well, perhaps. She returned to her chair, her fingers brushing the gramophone. "Tomorrow," she murmured to herself, "there's so much left to tell." But for now, she let the silence settle, the weight of her confession easing just a little. The fire glowed, the rain sang, and Jane Marple, the quiet girl who'd become a quiet sleuth, felt a flicker of peace. The story wasn't done, but she'd begun to unravel it, one word at a time.
Chapter 2. Shadows of the Summer Ball. The rain had softened to a drizzle outside Miss Marple's cottage, a gentle patter against the windows of St. Mary Mead. Inside, the fire still glowed, casting warm flickers across the room. Jane sat in her armchair, a fresh cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. The old gramophone hummed, its needle poised over a new wax record. She had paused after recording her first confession, needing time to gather her thoughts. The memories of that summer in 1923 were sharp now, like a photograph pulled from a dusty album. She pressed the gramophone's lever, and it whirred to life. "This is Jane Marple," she began, her voice steady but soft, "continuing my story. The summer ball was where it all began to unravel, though I didn't know it then." She closed her eyes, and the manor house came alive in her mind. It was the second night of the family gathering, and the air buzzed with excitement. The great hall was a sea of candlelight, with chandeliers sparkling like stars. Ladies in silk dresses twirled across the polished floor, their laughter mixing with the soft notes of a string quartet. Gentlemen in black suits sipped wine, their voices loud with stories. Jane,
young and shy in her plain blue dress, stood by a velvet curtain, watching it all like a sparrow on a branch. "I wasn't one for dancing," she said into the gramophone, a faint smile in her voice. "I like to watch, to notice. People show their true selves when they think no one's looking." And that night she saw plenty. Her uncle, Sir Henry Langley, stood by the grand fireplace, his face red from too much wine. He was loud, boasting about his sapphire necklace, the one that would vanish by morning. His wife, Aunt Beatrice, sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes kept darting to the door, as if waiting for someone who never came. Jane's cousin Clara was the star of the evening, her red dress bright as a poppy. She danced with every man who asked, her laughter ringing like bells. But Jane noticed something odd. Clara's eyes flicked to a tall man in a black suit, Mr. Carver, the stranger who called himself a family friend. Their glances were quick, secretive, like they shared a secret no one else knew. Jane tucked that thought away, like a pin in a cushion. The gramophone crackled as Jane paused, sipping her tea. The warmth steadied her, grounding her in the present before she slipped back to 1923. There was a hum in the air, like the buzz before a storm. Everyone was smiling, but it felt wrong, like a painting with a crack you can't quite see. She remembered the maid, Elsie, moving through the crowd with a tray of glasses. Elsie was young, barely older than Jane, with nervous hands and downcast eyes. When Sir Henry barked at her for spilling a drop of wine, Elsie flinched and the tray wobbled. Glasses clinked and one fell on the floor. The room barely noticed, but Jane did. She saw Elsie's face go pale, her fingers twisting her apron as she knelt to clean the mess. "Poor girl," Jane murmured into the gramophone. "I thought she was just clumsy then." But it wasn't clumsiness, it was fear. Jane had wandered the edges of the ball, her eyes catching flickers of strangeness. She saw Thomas, Sir Henry's valet, linger by the doorway, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He was a thin man with a sharp face, always quiet, always watching. When a guest bumped into him, Thomas muttered an apology and slipped out of the room. Jane wondered where he was going. She also noticed Mr. Carver again, standing alone by a window, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his glass. He was handsome, with dark hair and a smooth smile, but there was something cold in his eyes, like a cat watching a mouse. Then there was the argument. It was late, when the music had slowed and most guests were tipsy. Jane had stepped onto the balcony for air, the night cool against her skin. Below, in the shadowed garden, two voices hissed at each other. She couldn't see who they were, but the words were sharp. Something about money, debts, and keeping quiet. One voice sounded like Mr. Carver's, low and smooth. The other was rougher, angry, but too muffled to place. Jane leaned closer, her heart thumping, but a twig snapped under her foot. The voices stopped, and she hurried back inside before anyone could spot her. "I didn't know what I'd heard," Jane said, her voice soft in the gramophone's hum, "but it stuck with me, like a burr on a sweater. I kept thinking about it, turning it over in my mind." She had gone back to the ball, her head spinning with questions. Who was arguing? What did they owe? And why did it feel so dangerous? The rest of the night blurred in her memory, more dancing, more laughter, more wine. But Jane kept watching. She saw Aunt Beatrice slip away early, her face pale. She saw Clara whisper something to Mr. Carver, her hand brushing his sleeve. And she saw Sir Henry, drunk and loud, waving his sapphire necklace for all to see. "A king's ransom," he shouted, holding it high. The blue stone caught the light, dazzling the room. Jane felt a chill, though she didn't know why. When the ball ended, the guests stumbled to their rooms and the manor house grew quiet. Jane lay awake in her small guest room, the moonlight spilling through her window. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The glove she had found the day before, black, leather, a man's glove, sat in her sewing box, nagging at her. It didn't belong to Sir Henry or Thomas or any guest she had seen. Whose was it? And why had it been hidden under a cushion? I was young, Jane's voice crackled through the gramophone, but I wasn't foolish. I knew people weren't always what they seemed. That night, I started to see the manor house as a web, with everyone caught in it, some by choice, some by chance. She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. The fire popped in the hearth, and the rain whispered outside. "I didn't know it then," Jane said, "but the ball was the last bright moment before everything changed. By morning, the necklace was gone, and the shadows I'd seen started to take shape." Jane remembered the chaos of the next day. Sir Henry's shouts echoed through the manor as he raged about the missing necklace. Guests whispered, maids scurried, and Aunt Beatrice looked like she might faint. Jane had stayed quiet, watching, her mind already picking at the puzzle. The glove, the argument, Elsie's fear, Clara's glances, they were all pieces, but she didn't know how they fit. The gramophone spun silently for a moment as Jane gathered her thoughts. I wanted to help, but I was afraid of what I might find, afraid of what it might mean for my family. So I watched, and I waited, and I kept my secrets close. She stopped the machine with a gentle click, the needle lifting with a soft scratch. The cottage was quiet again, the fire's glow dimming. Jane leaned back, her knitting untouched on her lap. The memories were heavy, but speaking them felt like loosening a knot. She rose, slow and stiff, and moved to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the village dark and still. St. Mary Mead slept, unaware of the story she was weaving. Jane's eyes lingered on the horizon, where the manor house stood in her memory, its walls hiding truths she had spent a lifetime unraveling.
Chapter 3. The Midnight Discovery. The fire in Miss Marple's St. Mary Mead cottage had dwindled to a soft glow, its embers casting faint shadows on the walls. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the night still and damp. Jane sat in her armchair, her tea now cold on the table. The old gramophone hummed softly, its needle poised over a fresh wax record. She pressed the lever, and the machine whirred to life. "This is Jane Marple," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like a whisper carried by the wind. "The ball was over, but the night wasn't. That's when I saw something I couldn't forget, something that changed everything." Her mind slipped back to 1923, to the grand manor house bathed in moonlight. The summer ball had ended, and the guests had stumbled to their beds, leaving the hall silent. Jane, young and restless, couldn't sleep. The night felt heavy, like a blanket too thick to breathe under. She'd seen too much at the ball. Clara's secretive glances, Elsie's trembling hands, the stranger Mr. Carver's cold eyes, and the black glove hidden under a cushion. They buzzed in her head like bees, keeping her awake. "I always liked the quiet of night," Jane said into the gramophone, her voice soft but firm. "It's when people let their guards down, when secrets slip out." She'd pulled on her shawl and slipped into the corridor, her slippers silent on the polished floor. The manor was a maze of shadows, its oak doors and tall windows looming like silent watchers. She wandered aimlessly at first, her fingers trailing along the cool walls, her mind turning over the evening's odd moments. The gramophone crackled as Jane paused, her eyes distant. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt it. Something was wrong, like a note out of tune. She remembered stopping by a tall window, the moonlight spilling across the garden below. The roses glowed silver, and the air smelled of earth and dew. That's when she noticed the study door, just down the hall. It was always open during the day, but now it was shut tight, a faint light seeping from under it. Curious, Jane crept closer, her heart tapping like a drum. She pressed her ear to the door, but all she heard was silence. She tried the handle. Locked. That's odd, she'd thought. Sir Henry, her uncle, used the study for his papers and his precious sapphire necklace, the one he'd shown off at the ball. Why was it locked now, in the middle of the night? She stepped back, unsure, when a faint sound came from inside, a soft thump, like a book falling. Then nothing. I should have gone to bed, Jane said into the gramophone, her voice tinged with regret. But I was young, and curiosity was stronger than fear. She lingered, watching the door, but no one came out. The manor stayed quiet, the clock in the hall ticking like a heartbeat. Jane returned to her room, her mind racing. The locked door, the thump, the necklace, they felt connected, but she didn't know how. Morning came too soon. The manor woke to chaos. Jane was sipping tea in the breakfast room when shouts echoed from upstairs. Servants ran, guests whispered, and Aunt Beatrice's face went white as milk. Jane followed the crowd to Sir Henry's bedroom, her stomach tight. There he was, my uncle, lying in bed, still as stone. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. The doctor, a nervous man with a baggy suit, was already there muttering about a heart attack. Too much wine, he said, shaking his head. A bad heart. It happens. But Jane wasn't so sure. She stood in the doorway, unnoticed, her eyes scanning the room. Sir Henry's face was stiff, his hands clenched in the sheets. The air held a faint smell, sharp and strange, like bitter almonds. She'd read about poisons in her father's old books, things that smelled like that. Her heart sank. This wasn't a heart attack. This was something else. I didn't say anything, Jane's voice trembled in the gramophone. I was just a girl, and who would listen? But I saw things. The way his fingers curled like he'd been in pain, the smell in the air, and the necklace, it was gone, not on the table where he'd left it. She looked around, hoping for answers. Aunt Beatrice was sobbing, Clara was pale, and Mr. Carver stood in the corner, his face unreadable. Elsie, the maid, hovered by the door, her eyes red and frightened. Thomas, the valet, was nowhere to be seen. Jane had slipped away, her mind spinning. She went back to the study, hoping to find a clue. The door was open now, the room empty. Papers were scattered on the desk, and a single drawer was ajar. She peeked inside, nothing, but pens and a broken watch. But under the desk, half hidden by a rug, was a tiny speck of blue. She knelt, her fingers brushing the carpet. It was a sapphire bead, small enough to miss, but bright as a star. It must have come from the necklace. I kept it, Jane said, her voice low. I didn't know why, but I tucked it in my pocket with the glove I'd found. They were pieces of something bigger, something I didn't understand yet. She remembered standing in the study, her heart pounding. The manor felt different now, like a house holding its breath. The laughter of the ball was gone, replaced by whispers and tears. Back in her cottage, Jane leaned back in her chair, the gramophone still spinning. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Not of the murder, I didn't know it was murder then, but of what I might find. I loved my family, but I saw how they looked at each other, how they hid things. I started to wonder who I could trust." She remembered the rest of that morning. The doctor left, the guests murmured about tragedy, and Aunt Beatrice locked herself in her room. Clara tried to keep everyone calm, but her hands shook when she poured tea. Mr. Carver offered to help with arrangements, his voice smooth like silk. I watched him, noticing how his eyes flicked to the study door, like he knew something. And Elsie, she kept dropping things, her apron twisted in knots. I started to see patterns, Jane's voice grew stronger. Like when you knit and notice a stitch is wrong. The ball, the locked door, the smell, the bead, they were all part of it. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to keep looking. She spent the day moving quietly, listening to whispers, watching faces. The manor was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it, even if it meant facing truths she wasn't ready for. The gramophone clicked as Jane stopped it, the needle lifting with a soft scratch. The cottage was silent, the fire now just embers. She stared at the gramophone, her hands folded in her lap. The memories were heavy, like stones in her pockets, but speaking them felt right. She thought of the sapphire bead still tucked in her old sewing box and the glove beside it. They were small things, but they'd led her to a truth that changed her forever. Jane arose, her movements slow, and shuffled to the window. The village of St. Mary Mead lay dark, its houses quiet under the night sky. She thought of the manor, of Sir Henry's still face, of the almond scent that haunted her. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "I'll tell more." The threads were starting to come together even then. For now she let the silence settle, her confession weaving a little more of the story that she'd kept hidden for so long.
Chapter 4. Threads of Deception. The cottage in St. Mary Mead was hushed, the fire now a faint glow of embers. Outside, the night was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, the old gramophone humming softly before her. A fresh wax record spun under the needle, ready to capture her words. She leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with a weight only age could bring. "This is Jane Marple," she began, continuing my confession. "After the ball, after the discovery of my uncle's death, I began to see the threads of something darker. I was young and I made mistakes, but I was learning how to pull those threads apart." Our mind drifted back to 1923, to the grand manor house where grief and suspicion hung like fog. Sir Henry Langley's death had been called a heart attack, but Jane, barely 20, knew better. The bitter almond smell in his room, the sapphire bead under the study desk, and the black glove in her sewing box. They were clues, small but sharp, cutting through the lies. The manor buzzed with whispers about the missing necklace, but Jane's thoughts were on murder. "I was afraid," she said into the gramophone, her voice soft as a sigh. "Not just of what I'd find, but of who I'd hurt. My family was my world, and yet I saw how they hid things, how their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I remembered the day after Sir Henry's death, the manor heavy with silence. Guests lingered, unsure whether to stay or leave. Aunt Beatrice, pale and trembling, barely left her room. Clara, Jane's cousin, tried to keep everyone calm, but her laughter was gone. And Mr. Carver, the stranger, moved through the house like a shadow, always watching.
Jane had made a mistake early on, one that haunted her. She suspected Aunt Beatrice, her uncle's wife. Beatrice was quiet, nervous, always wringing her hands. That morning, Jane had overheard a maid whisper about a letter found in Beatrice's room, a note in Sir Henry's handwriting accusing her of betrayal. It seemed damning, and Jane's heart sank. Could her kind aunt, who loved gardening and tea, be a killer? "I was young," she said, her voice heavy, "and I let that letter blind me. I didn't see the whole pattern yet." She'd spent the day watching, listening, moving quietly through the manor. The letter nagged her, but other things didn't fit. She remembered Elsie, the maid, scrubbing the hall floor, her hands shaking. When Jane passed by, Elsie dropped her brush, muttering about seeing things she shouldn't. Jane knelt to help, noticing a small brass button caught in Elsie's apron. It was ornate, not a servant's, with a tiny crest etched into it. "Where did you find this?" Jane asked softly. Elsie's eyes widened, and she stammered, "Near the study, miss. I didn't take it." Jane kept the button, adding it to her sewing box with the glove and bead. "I started to see alibis like stitches," Jane's voice crackled through the gramophone. "Some held tight, others unraveled." She'd checked the train timetables in the manor's library, curious about who'd been where the night of the ball. Sir Henry's valet Thomas claimed he'd been in the village fetching medicine for his master, but the last train left at 9, and Jane had seen Thomas at the ball past 10, slipping out the side door. His alibi was a lie. Then there was Mr. Carver. She'd watched him at breakfast, his smooth smile never faltering. He'd offered to help with Sir Henry's papers, saying he knew the family's business. But Jane noticed his cufflinks, silver, not brass, but one was loose, as if it had been tugged. She thought of the button in Elsie's apron, its crest matching the Langley family's crest. Had it come from Carver's jacket? She couldn't be sure, but she tucked the thought away. The gramophone hummed as Jane paused, her fingers brushing her cold teacup. "I was starting to see the web," she said, "not just who did it, but why. The necklace was part of it, but there was more, something deeper, uglier." She remembered sitting in the manor's drawing room, pretending to read while listening to the guests. Clara whispered to a cousin about debts Sir Henry owed, debts that could ruin the family. Jane caught Mr. Carver's name in the conversation, his voice low and sharp. "He'll pay, one way or another," he said. Jane's heart skipped. Was Carver a creditor or something else? Her biggest mistake came that afternoon. She'd confronted Aunt Beatrice, her voice shaking, about the letter. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "It's not what you think, Jane," she whispered. "Henry was angry, but it was about money, not me." She showed Jane other letters, forged ones, written to look like Sir Henry's, accusing her of stealing the necklace. Someone wanted her blamed. Jane felt sick. She'd misjudged her aunt, seeing only one thread instead of the whole pattern. She apologized, Jane said into the gramophone, her voice thick. "But it taught me something. Evil hides in plain sight, dressed up in lies. I had to look closer, past what people wanted me to see." She'd gone back to the study, hoping for more clues. The sapphire bead was still in her pocket, its weight a reminder. She searched the room, finding nothing new except a faint scratch on the desk, like a knife had nicked it. She wondered if the necklace had been broken apart, its pieces scattered to hide the theft. Elsie's fear stuck with Jane too. The maid avoided the study, her eyes darting every time Jane asked about the night of the ball. "I didn't see nothing, miss," she said, but her hands twisted her apron tighter. Jane didn't push, but she watched. Elsie knew something, maybe not the whole truth, but a piece of it. The button, the fear, the study, they were connected. "I was knitting it together," Jane's voice grew firm. "The glove, the bead, the button, the lies, they were all part of the same cloth. I didn't know the whole picture, but I knew it wasn't just about the necklace. Someone had planned something worse, and Sir Henry paid the price." She remembered the almond smell in his room, the way his hands clenched the sheets. Poison, she was sure now, though she didn't know the word cyanide then. It was a truth too big for a young girl to face alone. The gramophone spun quietly as Jane leaned back, her eyes on the dying fire. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I couldn't stop. I loved my family, but I saw how secrets twisted them. I had to keep going, to find the truth, even if it hurt." She thought of Clara's pale face, Mr. Carver's cold eyes, and Thomas's lie about the train. They were all part of it, but the center was still hidden. She stopped the gramophone with a soft click, the needle lifting with a faint scratch. The cottage was silent, the night pressing against the windows. Jane rose, her joints stiff, and shuffled to the hearth to add a log. The fire flared, casting light across her wrinkled hands. She thought of the button, the bead, the glove, small things, but heavy with meaning. They'd led her to a truth she wasn't ready for, one she'd kept locked away for decades. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept, its houses dark under the starry sky. Jane's mind lingered on the manor, on the study's locked door, on the bitter smell of death. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I'll tell more." The threads were tightening, and I was starting to see the shape of it. For now, she let the quiet wrap around her, her confession weaving another piece of a story she'd carried too long.
Chapter 5. The Garden of Secrets. The embers in Miss Marple's St. Mary Mead cottage glowed faintly, casting a warm flicker across the room. Outside, the night was quiet, the village wrapped in a blanket of stars. Jane sat in her armchair, the old gramophone humming softly, its needle poised over a new wax record. Her hands rested in her lap, her knitting untouched, as memories of 1923 weighed heavy on her heart. She pressed the gramophone's lever, and it whirred to life. "This is Jane Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady, like a stream over smooth stones. "The manor was full of shadows, but it was in the garden I found the truth, or part of it. That's where I learned what it costs to keep a secret." Her mind drifted back to the Langley Manor, to the day after Sir Henry's death. The house was a tangle of grief and suspicion, with whispers about the missing sapphire necklace and hushed talk of his heart attack. Jane, young and sharp-eyed, knew it was no natural death. The bitter almond smell, the sapphire bead, the brass button, and the black glove in her sewing box pointed to murder. She'd misjudged Aunt Beatrice, misled by forged letters, but now her eyes were open, searching for the real killer. "I needed air," Jane said into the gramophone, her voice tinged with memory. "The manor felt like a cage, everyone watching each other, hiding things." She'd slipped out to the garden that afternoon, where roses and lavender grew wild, their petals heavy with dew. The air was cool, and the quiet soothed her. As a girl, she'd loved that garden, playing there with her childhood friend Edward, a kind boy with a shy smile. He'd been her first love, though she'd never said it aloud. Now, with Sir Henry gone, she felt drawn to the garden's peace, hoping it would clear her mind.
She wandered past the rose beds, her fingers brushing the soft petals. That's when she saw it, a patch of ground near the hedge where the dirt was freshly turned. Curious, she knelt, her dress catching on thorns. The soil was loose, as if someone had dug and covered it quickly. She brushed it aside, her heart tapping fast. Buried shallowly was a sprig of greenery, its leaves crushed but distinct. It smelled sharp, like the bitter almonds in Sir Henry's room. Jane's breath caught. She'd read about plants like that in her father's books, things that could kill if brewed or crushed. "I knew it then," Jane's voice trembled in the gramophone. "Poison, not a heart attack. Someone had planned it, used the garden to hide their work." She'd wrapped the sprig in her handkerchief, tucking it into her pocket with the bead, button, and glove. The garden, once her haven, felt different now, its beauty masking something dark. Jane remembered sitting on a stone bench, the sprig in her hands, her thoughts racing. Edward's face came to her mind, his gentle laugh, the way he'd listened when she talked about her dreams. He'd been at the ball, too, a quiet guest among the glittering crowd. She'd seen him watching Clara, her cousin, with a look she couldn't read. Was it love? Jealousy? She pushed the thought away, but it lingered, a loose thread in her mind. "I told Edward everything," Jane's voice cracked. "I trusted him. I needed someone to help me make sense of it." She'd found him later that day near the garden's fountain, sketching the roses in a small notebook. His face lit up when she saw him, but it dimmed as she poured out her fears, the poison, the clues, the forged letters blaming Aunt Beatrice. Edward listened, his eyes soft but serious. "Jane," he said, "you're seeing things others miss. But be careful. Some truths hurt more than lies." He walked her back to the manor, promising to keep her secret. But as they passed the hedge, Jane noticed his cufflink, a brass one, etched with the Langley crest, just like the button in Elsie's apron. Her stomach twisted. Was it a coincidence? Edward was family, a distant cousin, but he'd been close to Sir Henry, helping with the estate's accounts. Could he know something? She didn't ask, afraid of the answer. The gramophone hummed as Jane paused, her fingers brushing her cold teacup. She said, "I was torn. I loved Edward, or thought I did, but I saw how secrets twisted people, even those I cared for." Back in the manor, she'd pieced together more. The poison linked to the almond smell was likely cyanide, made from plants like the one she'd found. The motive was clearer now: money. Sir Henry's debts were no secret, and his will left everything to Aunt Beatrice, with a share for Clara. But there was a catch, a hidden heir, a younger sister named Margaret, kept secret to avoid scandal. Jane had overheard Clara whisper about her, a girl sent away to avoid gossip. She went to Clara. Jane's voice grew heavy. "I needed to know about Margaret." She'd found her in the library, her face pale, her hands clutching a book. Clara admitted the truth. Margaret was Sir Henry's sister, hidden to protect the family's name. Someone had threatened to expose her, demanding the necklace as payment. Clara swore she'd never told, but her eyes flicked away, guilty. Jane wondered if Clara had given in, or if someone else had used Margaret's secret to trap Sir Henry. "I saw the pattern then," Jane said, her voice firm. "The necklace was a distraction. The real prize was control. Money, power, the family's name. Someone poisoned Sir Henry to keep it all." She confronted Mr. Carver next, the stranger with cold eyes. In the drawing room, she asked him about his argument in the garden, the one she'd overheard. He smiled, smooth as glass, saying it was business, nothing more, but his cufflink was loose again, and she saw a tear in his jacket, where a button might have been. The biggest blow came that evening. Jane had gone to Elsie, the maid, hoping for answers about the button. Elsie broke down, sobbing. "I saw him," she whispered, "Mr. Carver, in the study the night of the ball. He had a vial, something shiny. I didn't tell. He'd hurt me." Jane's heart sank. Carver was the killer, but Elsie's fear meant he wasn't alone. Someone had covered it, someone close. "I spared them," Jane's voice broke in the gramophone. "Not Carver, he was guilty. But the others, Clara, maybe Edward, they were protecting Margaret, shielding her from ruin. I couldn't destroy them for it." She'd kept silent, tucking her clues away, vowing to find a way to expose Carver without breaking her family. The gramophone clicked as Jane stopped it, the needle lifting with a soft scratch. The cottage was silent, the fire nearly out. She leaned back, her eyes on the darkened window. The garden's poison, Edward's cufflink, and Elsie's confession were threads she'd woven into truth, but at a cost. She'd loved her family, even their flaws, and chose silence to save them.
Chapter 6. Echoes of Justice. The cottage in St. Mary Mead was wrapped in the quiet of early morning, the first light of dawn creeping through the windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, the air cool and still, the fire long gone out. The old gramophone sat before her, its brass horn catching the soft glow of a lamp. A fresh wax record spun under the needle, ready for her words. She pressed the lever, and the machine hummed to life. "This is Jane Marple," she said, her voice gentle but firm, like a breeze carrying truth. "The manor held its secrets tight, but I was unraveling them. I was young, scared, but I knew I had to find a way to make things right without breaking those I loved." Her mind slipped back to 1923, to the Langley Manor, where the air was thick with grief and hidden truths. Sir Henry's death, called a heart attack, was murder, poisoned by cyanide, its bitter almond scent a clue Jane couldn't ignore. The sapphire necklace was gone, and her clues, the black glove, the sapphire bead, the brass button, the crushed sprig, pointed to Mr. Carver, the cold-eyed stranger. But others were tangled in the web. Clara, protecting a secret sibling, Elsie, the frightened maid, and Edward, Jane's childhood love, whose cufflink matched the button. Jane had chosen silence to shield her family, but she couldn't let Carver walk free. "I was knitting the truth together," Jane said into the gramophone, her voice steady. "But truth is heavy. It pulls at you, demands to be seen." Back in the manor, she'd spent days watching, piecing the puzzle. She'd learned Carver was no family friend, but a creditor, owed a fortune by Sir Henry. The necklace was his price, but when Sir Henry refused, Carver turned to poison, using the garden's deadly plants. Elsie's whispered confession, seeing him in the study with a vial, sealed it. But Jane needed proof, something the police couldn't ignore. She remembered slipping into the study one night, the manor asleep. The room was dark, the desk still scratched where the necklace might have been broken apart. She searched Carver's coat, left on a chair, and found a folded note in his pocket. It was in Sir Henry's handwriting, but the ink was fresh, not faded, a forgery, promising Carver the necklace for his silence about Margaret, the hidden sibling. Jane's heart raced. This was it, the proof Carver had forged letters to frame Aunt Beatrice and cover his crime. "I was careful," Jane's voice softened. "I couldn't confront him. He was dangerous, and I was just a girl." She'd taken the note, hiding it with her other clues. The next day she watched Carver closely. He was smooth, offering to handle Sir Henry's affairs, but his eyes flicked to Elsie, who avoided him.
Jane saw fear in the maid's face and guilt in Clara's, who knew more than she'd said. Edward, too, was quiet, his sketches abandoned. She wondered if he'd helped Carver, perhaps unknowingly, to protect Margaret. The gramophone crackled as Jane paused, her fingers brushing the armrest. She said, "I made a choice," her voice heavy in the gramophone. "I couldn't destroy my family, but I couldn't let evil win." She devised a plan, simple but clever. Using a servant's typewriter, she typed an anonymous letter to the village constable, detailing Carver's motive, the poison, and the forged note. She included the sapphire bead and the brass button, wrapped in plain paper, and left the package at the post office, addressed with no name. She sent it and prayed it was enough. Weeks later, news came. Carver had been arrested, not for murder, but for fraud in another town. The constable had searched his belongings, finding traces of cyanide and a pawned sapphire that matched the necklace. The Manners case was reopened, and though the murder was never fully proved, Carver was jailed for years. The necklace was returned to Aunt Beatrice quietly, and Margaret's secret stayed safe. Clara hugged Jane, tears in her eyes, never knowing her cousin's role. Edward left for London, his smile dimmer, and Jane never asked about the cufflink. "I let them heal," Jane's voice wavered in the gramophone. "Clara, Beatrice, even Elsie, they deserved peace. I kept my part hidden, but it changed me. I saw how people hide their hearts, how greed twists them. I vowed to watch, to learn, to never let evil slip by again." She'd returned to St. Mary Mead, her sewing box heavier with its secrets, her eyes sharper for it. The gramophone spun silently as Jane leaned back, dawn's light touching her face. She said, "It was my first case, though I didn't know it then. I was just Jane, a girl who saw too much. But it taught me to trust the small things, gloves, buttons, looks. They tell the truth when people won't." She stopped the machine with a gentle click, the needle lifting with a soft scratch. The cottage was quiet, the village waking beyond the window. Jane rose, her movement slow, and shuffled to the window. St. Mary Mead glowed in the morning light, its houses soft and familiar. She thought of the manor, of Carver's cold eyes, of Edward's sketches, and
Chapter 7. A Final Stitch. The dawn had fully broken over St. Mary Mead, painting the cottage in soft gold. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, the air crisp and quiet, the gramophone's brass horn gleaming faintly in the morning light. Her tea was cold, forgotten on the table, her knitting needles still in her lap. The final wax record spun under the needle, ready to hold the last of her confession. She pressed the lever, and the machine hummed softly. "This is Jane Marple," she said, her voice calm, like a river finding its end. "I've told the story of that summer in 1923, of secrets and murder, of truths I kept hidden. Now it's time to finish, to tie the final knot." Her mind drifted back to the Langley Manor, where the echoes of Sir Henry's death lingered. The sapphire necklace was returned, Mr. Carver was jailed, and the family began to heal, unaware of Jane's quiet hand in it all. She'd been a girl of 20, her sewing box heavy with clues. The black glove, the sapphire bead, the brass button, the poison sprig. She sent an anonymous letter to the constable, exposing Carver's crime without breaking her family. The matter settled, but Jane carried the weight of what she'd done, and what she hadn't said. "I was changed," Jane said into the gramophone, her voice steady but soft. "I saw the world differently after that. People's smiles, their words, They hid things, but I learned to see through them. Back in St. Mary Mead, she'd returned to her quiet life, helping her mother with chores, knitting by the fire. But her eyes were sharper, her mind always turning, catching the little things others missed. The glove had taught her about carelessness, the bead about greed, the button about betrayal, the sprig about cruelty. She remembered the letter from her cousin Clara, the one she'd found in the attic just yesterday. It was written years after the manor, when Clara was married and far away. "Jane, you always saw more than you said," she read. "I never thanked you for keeping us safe." Clara hadn't known the whole truth, but she'd sensed Jane's role. The letter had stirred her memories, urging her to speak, to record this confession for herself, if no one else. "I burned it this morning," Jane said, her voice low. "The letter, I mean. It was time to let it go." She'd stood by the fire before dawn, watching the yellowed paper curl and blacken, its words fading into ash. It felt right, like snipping a loose thread. The manor, the murder, the secrets, they were part of her, but they no longer held her. She'd done what she could, and justice, quiet as it was, had prevailed. The gramophone hummed as Jane paused, her eyes on the window. "I learned something that summer. Evil isn't clever. It's just loud, preying on those who don't look closely. But goodness, quiet goodness, it's stronger. It sees the truth in small things, a glance, a stitch, a whisper." She thought of Aunt Beatrice, tending her roses again, of Clara, smiling with her children, of Elsie, who left the manor for a better life. Even Edward, her lost love, had found peace, though they never spoke of that summer again. Jane's fingers brushed her knitting, the needles clicking once, a familiar comfort. "She kept watching," she said, "all my life. Every village, every face had its own puzzle. I solved them, not for fame, but because it was right." She smiled faintly, her voice warm. "This confession, it's my last stitch. The story's done, and I'm at peace." She stopped the gramophone with a soft click, the needle lifting with a faint scratch. The cottage was silent, the morning light spilling across the floor. Jane arose, her joints creaking, and shuffled to the window. St. Mary Mead sparkled in the sun, its houses cozy and familiar. She thought of the manor, of 1923, of the girl she'd been. Curious, scared, but brave. The clues in her sewing box were long gone, given to time, but their lessons stayed, woven into her life. "I don't need to tell anyone else," she murmured, her breath fogging the glass. The gramophone records would stay in the attic, unheard, a quiet end to a quiet truth. She turned back to her chair, picking up her knitting. The needles clicked, steady and sure, as she began a new row. Life was like that, tangled, but resolvable, if you paid attention. Outside, the village awoke, its sounds soft and alive. Jane Marple, the girl who became a sleuth, felt the weight of her confession lift. The story was complete, the pattern whole. She knitted on, her heart light, knowing some secrets were best kept and some truths were best set free.